Well, good morning, and let me ask you to open your Bibles this morning once again to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, and as you're turning, let me introduce my guest, our friend today. This is Dr. Robert Lopez, and Robert is a professor of humanities at the Scarborough College at Southwestern Seminary. Been in that role for about 3 years, and so he has the opportunity to impact lots and lots of our seminary students. And so, Robert, we're glad to have you. His wife, Mia, and Robert have 2 children, and so we're grateful to have you with us today. And you'll see why I have Robert with me on the platform. We're in this series that we've entitled In His Image. And we're talking about what it means for us to be created in the image of God. So once again, let's just look at the scriptures beginning in verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over the livestock and over all the earth and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So God created the first human beings in his image. But also every human that is born since then is also in the image of God. And so we talked last week about what that means to be image bearers of God. We talked about how that gives to every individual a special kind of dignity. And we're going to explore what that means over the course of this series. But also, it gives to us our identity. We do not have the right, the privilege to identify ourselves. God has done that in creating us. He created us in his image, and it goes on to say in verse 27 that he creates humans male and female. And then he goes on to say that they are to be fruitful and to multiply. And of course, God's beautiful design of the male and the female makes the fulfillment of that mandate possible. So we talked last week about the beauty and the wisdom of God in the way he has created us in his image and created us male and female. And so our understanding of this concept helps us, number one, to see ourselves the way we should, but also it helps us to see others the way God wants us to see them. But the fact that we're created in the image of God and created male and female also informs our discussion about an issue that is very critical in our culture today about homosexuality and transgenderism, gender confusion. So that's why I've asked Robert to help us today. Robert, you come from a rather, as you call it, unorthodox family situation. And so that gives you a platform and a calling to address this issue. Tell us about that.
Well, first I wanted to thank you and thank everyone for coming and giving me a chance to speak. This is a beautiful church. It's my first time here, so thank you very much for that. I did not really ever want to go and be a public spokesperson on LGBT issues, but I did feel called to it at the age of 41 when in 2012. Because I did have an unusual experience, and what I would say is it gave me a lot of information and perspective. The LGBT issue very often is mysterious to people. It's mysterious even to people who claim that they are LGBT, because you're talking about concepts that are vague and that are very subjective and that are not necessarily rooted in physical reality. I was raised in a gay home. My mother was gay, so she was in a relationship with the same woman from the time that I was a baby until my mother died when I was 19. So I grew up very much in the LGBT community, and I saw the lesbian side of it. I dealt with the struggle of being a boy in a home full of women who didn't think that men were valuable, to put it bluntly. When I was growing up, it's hard to nail it down because things were evolving. I was born in 1971. So as I was growing up, the gay community was also changing. It went from being a very small fringe community to really growing in size and influence and in its access to the media. But to the extent that I was in that environment and I was around a lot of people who were living that lifestyle, that was what was normal to me. Heterosexuality never looked normal to me growing up. It always looked odd to see a man and a woman embracing or kissing or any of that. So I was actually introduced into the act at the age of 13. There were two older boys who got me very drunk. I had seen a lot of pornography, so I was already kind of desensitized to sex. And I didn't realize that that was abuse until I got much, much older. But essentially, there was two older teenage boys, and they taught me how to do this. And I stayed in that activity until I was 28. And that was when a series of events led me to get out of it. And at that point, I was working at MTV Networks in New York City, and I got cancer. So I left that job. I had to go for cancer treatments, and I started a PhD program. And I went on to learn a lot about the literature and culture of the world. I met my wife 20 years ago. We're still together. That's the only woman I've ever been with. So despite all of my terrible behavior in the gay world, once I went back to being straight. I'll explain why I put it that way. But once I went back to God's design, I did stick with just one woman. So I kind of give myself some credit for that, or give the Lord credit for that. I went through that experience of being a scholar, and I learned a lot of languages. I know 8 languages, so I was able to study ancient cultures, Renaissance cultures, medieval cultures. So when this issue blew up, there were a lot of claims and counterclaims that were going back and forth, and I found that people were so burdened by this debate. It was a debate really unlike other debates that I've seen in the public square. It gets very emotional. It gets very painful, and I think a lot of that is because it strikes at identity in a way that other debates, let's say about race or about women, those don't destabilize our identity as much as the debate on LGBT does, because ultimately what the LGBT movement is saying is that their identity is different, even though there's no biological reality that can prove it. It's all in their head. It is what I would call subjective reality, and I think that places it deeply in conflict with our Christian faith and with God's design, because we know what God authored because of our physical body, right? But to say I am gay or I am trans, when you have the same organs, the same brain, heart, liver, and genitalia as other people, but you're saying you're different because of something happening in your head, all of a sudden identity becomes something that's very shifting, and it's very hard to know what it is. And it doesn't come from God. The Bible clearly says, lean not on your own understanding. You know, our ways are not God's ways. Our thoughts will lead us astray. And that's essentially what I saw the LGBT movement doing. So I felt that I had to come forward. And it took a while for me to really figure out what my position was on these debates, because as it spilled into the church, the question became, are gay people saved? Can gay people join your church? Is it wrong to preach that it is a sin? Should we confer marriage on them? Should we let them adopt? Should we baptize their children? A lot of these very difficult doctrinal and practical questions. It came clear to me after a lot of prayer that my position on it's pretty basic, okay? The line that you just read from Genesis says clearly, God created male and female. And that passage of Genesis also does an explanation of itself. It kind of does an apologetics within the text. It says that because of this, man leaves the home of his father and wife and becomes one and joins or no, I'm sorry. He leaves the home of his father and mother and cleaves to his wife to become one flesh. And they are no longer two, but one. And then it says, be fruitful and multiply. And then Jesus Christ, despite the fact that everybody says he never mentioned anything about sexuality, he doubles down on Genesis in Matthew 19. And he adds to that passage saying, what the Lord has brought together, let no man put asunder. So I realized that what we've been doing in the church, in my view, has been a little bit off focus. We've been debating as to whether homosexuality is a sin or whether gay people are this or that. The reality is that the Bible already answers this for us. We are all heterosexual. Mm-hmm. Every single person in this room, every single person on this planet is heterosexual. Because, the Bible isn't scared of sex. It very clearly, when you add all those passages together, it clearly means that God created us to engage in sexual intercourse, but that act is set apart from everything else because there's something fundamentally different. The sensations that the sex act unleashes inside us are not like sight or smell or hearing or other senses. It's something very, very different, and it's something that you can only attain with the union of two bodies that were designed for that act.
Male and female.
Male and female. I mean, our bodies fit together. And I don't want to make people uncomfortable, but that the Bible says it. It says, be fruitful and multiply. It could not be clearer as to what God created us for. So the people that are sort of circulating in the world saying, well, I'm gay, I'm not straight, you can't try to make me straight. I realize that this is very much a debate that has gone off focus. We're getting really far astray. Everybody already is straight. You have the body for it. And I know from my own experience and from the hundreds of men that I have discipled who have tried to get out of homosexuality, the reality is that once you stop living inside of your head, once you stop analyzing yourself so much, once you stop trying to say, my identity is based on what I want, what I feel, the effect that other people have on me, what I enjoy, what I think I might enjoy, once you get outside of your head and you just live in your body and you determine your identity based on what God created you for, the gifts that God gave you, and how you can bring happiness to other people with those gifts, the issue goes away. Because, and I'll be very blunt on this, I'm a man with a lot of very ugly carnal experience, but I feel like I can use it for good. That's the thing. I am not physically equipped to give pleasure to a man. Mm-hmm. I have engaged in that act, and I have tried to do something, tried to have that act happen, and it doesn't bring happiness to him. Mm-hmm. It doesn't. And it's not just me. I know enough from being involved in the gay community for a long time. That's the reality of gay culture. That's the big dark secret at the core of all of it, is that they're focused on this sex act, which makes them unhappy. It makes them unhealthy. It doesn't leave them fulfilled. That's why their relationships are very brief. They're unstable. Lesbian relationships are very violent. They're often very abusive. I mean, these are statistics that you can get just from people who have studied the rates of abuse and mental disorders in the gay community. It's the act doesn't make you happy because you're not doing something that God designed you to do. You're rebelling against God ultimately. And it's not difficult, it's not mysterious of how you stop doing that act and you prepare yourself for courtship and you meet someone of the opposite sex and you marry them. And if you take enough time to rebuild yourself, rebuild your, in this case for men, masculinity, when you rebuild it and you spend a lot of time in the Word of God and you rebuild your relationship with Jesus Christ, you'll realize that your sexuality was given to you by God in order to find a woman to give pleasure to. Now, even if you're called to singleness, which, some people are, you still have to mentally understand the beauty of heterosexuality. You have to be heterosexual because you can't walk around thinking that the opposite sex is not worth you know, anything. You know, you have to sort of have the attitude that God created both sexes and they're beautiful and they belong with each other. But what I can say is that being in my relationship with my wife, I am physically equipped to give her a happiness and a joy. And I feel when I'm with my wife that the Lord is rejoicing, that it's an act that I feel when God looks upon it, he's happy. You know, God is thinking to himself, I created these two people. They have gifts. She can give him this incredible joy and children. He can give her this incredible joy and children. My job is well done. You know, that's what I think. That's what I think God says.
He says it's very good.
Right.
In that process, he creates.
Yeah.
If I could just, and so this gives us an understanding of your background and why God has called you into this discussion in the church today, and God's using you in an amazing way. I want to just, because part of the motivation in this series is to help equip us as a church to speak to the issue in culture, and it's even coming up in presidential politics. Perhaps you've heard one of the presidential candidates, Pete Buttigieg, is an openly gay mayor in Indiana, and Vice President Mike Pence confronted him or challenged him about his gay lifestyle, and this is what Pete Buttigieg said. He said, "The thing I wish the Mike Pences of the world would understand, that if you have a problem with who I am, your problem is not with me. Your quarrel, sir, is with my Creator." He says he's a believer, but he's in this gay lifestyle, and so he says, your quarrel, sir, is with my Creator. Robert, how do we answer that question when somebody, and we hear it all the time, and the Methodist Church is blowing up over this, even as we speak. So how do we answer that question and that challenge that, well, this is the way God made me? You've addressed that partly already. Tell us more about how we confront that.
Well, I think it's important always to distinguish between a leader or a public figure like Buttigieg, who is actively trying to indoctrinate people in his thing, versus the gay person who walks into your church and who's struggling to reconcile his faith. Obviously, we're going to be a lot gentler with the person coming into the church who's just questioning themselves. They may have been overwhelmed by the pornographic culture around us and they're confused. But to Pete Buttigieg, I mean, then I think you do have to have a strong apologetic. You have to have a strong Christian response. What I would say to someone like that is I would break down what he said and hold him to his words. He said, if you have a problem with who I am, you have a problem with my Creator. I would say, you know, you're right about that, because your identity comes from God, but you're wrong about who you are. You are not gay. Nobody is gay. You can say you're gay. Nobody is gay. That is not an identity. It's a fiction. It's something in your head. You're living inside of your head. I'm sure that you're going to give me the script that I used to give and everyone in the gay community tends to give, which is, well, I knew from the time I was 6 or 7, I had these feelings. I knew I was different, and people made fun of me, and I felt, you know, and then when I came out and I didn't have to live a lie and I could be true to myself, I felt, you know, I'm sure he could give me that script, but I would just break down that script and say, okay, so there were things going on in your head, and you based your whole identity on your interior life. You know, why are you saying that you're gay and Mike Pence is not? You have the same organs, you have the same lungs and heart and liver and everything else. You're both male. What is the difference? It's things that are going on in your head. Those things don't come from God. The Bible is full of passages. Just read the Psalms about lean not on your own understandings. Okay? Your mind will lead you astray. Romans 1 probably gives the best outline of this, of how what happens is once you exchange the truth for a lie, your mind is delivered up to your depraved desires, and it starts to go deeper and deeper and deeper. And then, you know, in Romans 1 it says, once you accommodate the act and you say that that is normal, and you've replaced the normal act that God created with this act that you've created in your head, then all these other sins of character come into play. You become a deceiver. You become murderous and gossiping and backstabbing and rebellious against parents and a hater of God and a contriver of evil. Because the deeper problem here is when you decide that you are going to attribute to God things that you invented in your head. Now, when I'm dealing with people individually who are really struggling with this, maybe they were bullied. This is a classic example. They were bullied when they were in middle school, and the gay community was the only place where they felt safe. That was the only place where people embraced them and said, okay, you're a good person. So for them, this is a question of their own personal validation. They've invested a lot in this identity. It's not something that they can really give up. I tell them, okay, so maybe you can identify as a survivor, as someone who overcame things, as a fighter, as someone who you were the underdog. Those are all identities that make somewhat of sense, because you can say that God in his providence brought you through those tribulations for this good reason. But why would you, in response to all of that suffering, label yourself in a way that takes away your dignity? Because I'm not saying that you're gay, or at least this is what I would say to Pete Buttigieg if it were me. I would say, I'm not saying you're gay. You're the one who's bringing this up and saying that you're gay. To say that you're gay means that your whole identity is consumed in a sex act that you won't even talk about publicly. Mm-hmm. And I know why you won't talk about it publicly, because people find it repulsive. So why would you build your identity on that? You yourself are the one who is taking on this indignity. And if the question is that you were looking for a place to belong and a place to be accepted, there's other ways to do that rather than to invest all of your identity in the sex act. Because if we think back, and this is what I would say to Pete Buttigieg, if we think back to what I said about the senses of sight and smell and touch and all these things, okay? It could be that you look at a male and you really appreciate a beautiful male, and that's the sense of sight, right? But when you are engaged in the sex act, that's not the sense that makes it a true act that God ordained. Do you understand what I mean? So you're confusing a bunch of things, and that's because you're living in your head. You're seeing something that's really beautiful. You like the beauty of it. You're drawn to it, perhaps. I'm not sure whether that's entirely bad, but it is bad if then you jump from that to saying, I'm going to devote myself to a lifetime of sexual activity with this, which is, in a certain sense, you're going to keep on doing it and trying to get that feeling of satisfaction that you think you're going to get when you look at a beautiful picture. But the problem is that your bodies are not made for it. And so even if you look at a beautiful picture of a muscular man, you can't do anything. That's it. It ends there. He's a beautiful man, and you can't consummate something with him. Does that make sense? I mean, what I would say to Pete Buttigieg is, you are right that our true identity comes from God, and that if someone rejects your true identity, they are rejecting your creator, but you're wrong about who you are. And what you'll find is that is a very loving way to speak to a lot of very committed gay activists, but it makes them very angry, because they have, to a certain degree, connected their desire for an identity to make them feel good about themselves to this sex act, which is, harmful. So it's tough.
Wow. And this is a conversation that could go on for hours.
Yeah.
And Robert is a tremendous resource on this. And I want to just say he'll be available here at the end of the service if you'd like to come speak with him. As he said, he disciples young men who are struggling with this. We have a ministry in our church called Safe Place, and there's information in the worship guide this morning where you can go online to our website and click on resources and Safe Place, and there you can learn about how this support group works in our church. It's a group of compassionate people that meet together regularly to encourage if you're struggling with the lifestyle or if you have a loved one who is. I think about Jesus, his encounter with the immoral woman that the religious leaders brought to him, and they wanted to stone her because she was sexually immoral. You know, when you talk about homosexuality, it's sexual immorality just like heterosexual immorality. It's all the same in God's eyes. It's immorality, and Jesus, the way he responds to this woman is very helpful to us. Remember, he said to her, he first of all says to the religious leaders, if any of you is without sin, you throw the first stone. And of course, they all had to walk away because they all knew that they were sinners. But then the way that Jesus responded to her lovingly shows us how we can lovingly and also biblically respond to this issue. He says to her, neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin. So he calls it what it is, but he loves her enough to say to her, I care about you, and I'm not judging you. I'm redeeming you. I'm saving you. I'm helping you to experience the life that you were created for by God. And so if you're here today and you're wrestling in this lifestyle, you need to hear Jesus saying, neither do I condemn you, but go and leave your life of sin. And the good news about Jesus is that when we put our trust in him, he actually gives us the ability to do that. Robert, your testimony is to the glory of God that he gave you the power to overcome a sinful lifestyle. But whether it's homosexuality or greed or materialism or bitterness or hatred or bigotry or whatever it is, Jesus is the secret. And so I want to say to you this morning as we wrap up our service, just draw near to him. Jesus, just come into the presence of Jesus today for what it is that you need. In fact, would you just bow your head, please, right now? And I want Bill to just sing over us as we wrap up today, just to sing this over us.